Russia and Ukraine. Let's talk about this for a second because I know it's been in the news recently since Joe Biden ended up deploying those troops. I think it was about I forget the exact number. Don't have it right off the top of my head, but Joe Biden did deploy a significant number of troops, but not into Ukraine. I think this is the common misconception we have here. I see a lot of news articles. I see a lot of people saying that Joe Biden is deploying troops into Ukraine. No, this is not true. Joe Biden is deploying troops to Eastern European countries, not Ukraine, particularly not Ukraine. The countries he has deployed troops to include Poland, Germany, and Romania as of right now. So as of right now, we're looking at Poland, Germany, and Romania as the three countries that Joe Biden has deployed troops into. And Biden is basically saying by deploying these troops, he's not directly saying this in comments, but he's kind of showing through these moves that he's kind of showing Vladimir Putin that the United States is basically ready to defend Ukraine at any moment. Basically, telling the Russian troops that if they, happen to invade Ukraine, which Joe Biden has been on the record saying that will probably happen, the United States will be ready to back Ukraine up if the situation is escalated to a more serious matter. I don't believe the United States right now views Ukraine and this border crisis between Russia and Ukraine as something serious, but we'll see kind of how it happens. In my opinion, though, I think this is a global conflict that could get bad very, very quickly. Russia's a ticking time bomb. The way I look at the world, and particularly like Europe and Asia, is that there's a few ticking time bombs within, kind of this scape of the world that we have. And you probably know those ticking time bombs. I think one of them is North Korea. Okay. The other one is China. And then the third one is Russia. Any one of those three countries makes an erratic move, suddenly the whole world should be worried because you are dealing with some of the most volatile politicians in the world. But not only the most volatile politicians in the world, you're dealing with some irrational decision makers. And when you get irrational decision makers into these positions of power, things could get very frisky very quickly. And that's where I believe that if Vladimir Putin decides to make the wrong move here and maybe goes after, in my opinion, makes the wrong move and goes after Ukraine, this could turn into an international conflict very, very fast. Okay, so what's the background behind Russia and Ukraine? Let's get into that first. The UN Security Council, which is basically a group in the United Nations of the arguably most powerful nations when it was created post World War II. They basically have been unable to come to an agreement on what to do internationally. So they are struggling to come up with an agreement. Joe Biden, the American president, as you guys know, has apparently been trying to just be diplomatic. He's been on calls with the Ukrainian president, Vladimir Putin. Nothing has worked, obviously, as of right now. The Russian troops kind of stand pat right now at the Ukrainian border. They haven't invaded as of whatever the date is, I think February 4th today. But the tensions have been growing higher and higher. And basically, Russia has put the ball in America's court and said, okay, we're here. We can invade at any moment we want. We have several thousands of troops waiting at the border to just, start to slowly take over Ukraine. Or not take over Ukraine, but we have several thousand troops just standing pat here at the border. So do with that what you will. It's kind of a power move on Russia's part. And Ukraine has gone on the record and basically requested foreign support from various Western allies, including NATO allies, as well as America. So this is the first time in a while that Ukraine has actually gone on the record and requested foreign support, which is kind of insane if you want to think about it that way. And right now, the situation is basically it's a tense border situation. You have a bunch of Russian troops gathered at the Ukrainian border. They haven't really done anything quite yet, but it could very well get bad very, very quickly. Jen Psaki, who's the White House press secretary, and the White House want to keep this narrative going that it's Putin versus the world. And in part, they're not wrong. It really is Vladimir Putin versus the world to a certain extent. This is a really, really bad situation. And obviously, Vladimir Putin has been an irrational decision maker who has made very questionable decisions here in the past, 10, 15 years since he's basically been president of Russia in 2004. This is not looking good. So if the United States does theoretically align with Ukraine, which is expected to happen, it could become a Cold War-esque type of conflict where the way I think about it is like the Cold War was a war that was fought between two countries in other countries, right? Like Korea and Vietnam happened because Russia and the United States were secretly fighting each other, but they didn't want to fight each other. They didn't want to invade each other's countries, so they used other wars to fight each other. And that's basically what happened, right? And I think that could potentially happen in Ukraine here again, which would be very, very sad because a lot of innocent civilians' lives would be lost. But I want to hope it doesn't get to that point of like full on war. I don't think it will, but we will see. In terms of the issues with like Russia and Ukraine, I guess you can think about it like this. Ukraine is kind of like the little brother to Russia, right? It's very much in this monstrosity of a country's shadow. They've never really been able to escape it. The cultures are similar. They're, kind of the little brother in a lot of ways. Economically, they aren't as relevant. They're a solid country. They're a first world country, obvious. They're a first world country within Eastern Europe, but they're not the massive power that Russia really is. It's just the truth of the matter. And the issue of being the little brother and being kind of this sort of pushover of a country has gone back to like medieval Europe. I'm talking like the 900s and like 10, 11 and like shit like that. Like this goes way, way back. And there's a lot of history, a lot of historical battles of various countries in various empires in annexing and making Ukraine a part of their empire, which is a reason why their culture is so contains a lot of Eastern European influences from various other countries and not just Russia, but Russia obviously being the majority. But besides the thousands of years of history, countries have taken over Ukraine for years, and they've treated their people absolutely horribly. I'm going to kind of go through that history right now in a few seconds here after I talk about this. Kremlin officials have gone on this is very odd. This doesn't happen within society. I want to make this very clear. Kremlin officials have basically gone on the record and said that Ukrainians are Russians. And they don't doubt it. That's like if Joe Biden went on the record today and said Mexicans are Americans. And we basically don't feel any way about their country. And they basically disrespect everything about Ukrainian culture. Kremlin officials have, and they've gone public on the record. You can look this up. This is on news. This is on the news. This is on everywhere. So the disrespect that Russia has towards Ukraine is obviously very evidently clear. And the way that I like to equate Ukraine in kind of like an international sense, I've talked a lot about Afghanistan on this show, and Ukraine is very much like Afghanistan. It's the Afghanistan of Eastern Europe, and a lot of European powers have, and a lot of Eastern Europe, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russia, a lot of powers have had their various influence in their time controlling Ukraine. Ukraine has been independent for a very limited amount of time. And it basically first got its independence at the end of World War I, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire fell apart and the Russian Empire also collapsed, leading to basically Ukraine being its own independent nation for the first time. Actually, a lot of countries got their independence after World War I because a lot of empires collapsed. So a lot of newly formed nation states basically began to take place. But Ukrainian independence, as in its history, didn't really last long because Poland invaded. And then eventually after that, Ukraine basically became a part of the Soviet Union once again. So, their lack of affiliation with Russia basically just within 5 years, they were right back in it, right back part of Russia, right back part of the Soviet Union, back then. And then you have the 1930s, right? So you have the period before World War II. And that's when Joseph Stalin was in charge of the Soviet Union. As you guys know, Joseph Stalin was a horrible leader, did a lot of terrible things. And one of those terrible things that he did was he had mass executions, particularly focused on Ukrainian peasants, because Ukrainian peasants were actually one of the groups that refused to take part in Joseph Stalin's 5-year plans, which involved mass amounts of, farming and basically just constant economic output and growth. And Ukrainian peasants, a lot of them didn't take part. And Joseph Stalin basically went and executed all of them, or a lot of them. And if they didn't want to take part of the Russian economy, he got rid of them. There was also various other reasons why. You could definitely take a delve into Joseph Stalin's time and his relationship with Ukraine. That is a whole separate other narrative within this very long history between these two countries. But yeah, Joseph Stalin definitely had his say within that period of time. Then you fast forward to World War II. The Ukraine was eventually invaded by Nazi Germany. And basically a lot of Ukrainians did fight for the Soviets, but it ended up like basically decimating the population. I think 1/6 of the population was dead after World War II. And I know this is a pretty common statistic in a lot of European countries. A lot of casualties took place because a lot of people, basically every country in the world fought in World War II, except for, I believe, Switzerland and Austria, I want to say. I think those are the two. But yeah, a lot of countries were fighting, and a lot of European countries took massive casualties in terms of their overall, um, population. I think Poland was also one of those countries that did as well, amongst others as well. But Ukraine also had a massive hit when it came to its population. So fast forward through the Cold War, you have the United States and Russia going at it back and forth, and then eventually, or the Soviet Union back then, and eventually they got their Ukraine got their independence from the Soviet Union back in 1991. So finally, Ukraine in the modern era sort of has its independence, and it's free for the first time. So during that time of independence, during this time, Ukraine sort of in the early 90s very much solidifies their alliance with NATO and the US and other like several Western foreign powers. So basically, like they got their backing, they got their butts covered with very significant Western powers. Then after that, you got Russia again. They're always going to be there. They're the country right above. They're the big brother. And Russia has continued since 1991 to intervene in their elections. And they've somehow managed to get politicians of their interest, people that they back, people that back Russian interests, to the forefront and get politicians in Ukrainian elections who are pro-Kremlin. So people who are going to work with Russia and work with Russia's best interests. They're basically intervening in Ukrainian elections to a certain extent. I don't know what that extent is. I haven't really done enough research to be able to comment on that. But the most evident example of Russian sort of intervention takes place with the Orange Revolution back in 2004. So for those of you that don't know the Orange Revolution, I'm going to explain it real quick. There were two candidates in this kind of Ukrainian democratic election. There was this guy, Yushchenko, who is, and sorry if I'm butchering these names, by the way. Yushchenko was basically a Western-facing candidate, someone who wanted to work with the West, with Ukraine's allies that they'd established back in the 90s, et cetera, and someone who was very Western and progressive in terms of his ideals. And then you had Yanukovych, who was the preferred Kremlin candidate and was also backed by the previous prime minister of Ukraine. So he had some sort of clout when it came to that. So you have those two kind of going at it in this election. The election essentially, whether you like it or not, becomes another sort of Western versus Soviet Union sort of battle. And they duke it out. And there ends up being a lot of flawed voting. So there's a lot of like voting that turns out to be fraud. And, there's it's deemed that Russia has somehow intervened in this election. And basically, in the first two rounds of the so the first two rounds, what I mean by that is they ran the election for the first time. They deemed that there was some error. And then they ran it again for a second time. And they deemed there was another error. And it basically, both times, this guy, Yanukovych, the Russian candidate, ended up winning by, I believe it was a 9 to 10% margin both times. So he ends up winning both times. But then protesters in Ukraine knew that something was up, and they ended up wearing orange, and they took to the streets, and they, used their voice in a lot of protests. And basically, that's what ended up being the Orange Revolution, is Ukrainian citizens said enough is enough. Let's get another revote, because these revotes are clearly not fair. And so fast forward, they revote again, and Yushchenko ends up winning, who's the Western-facing candidate. And that pisses Russia off. 2004, the Orange Revolution was kind of the catalyst of Russia continuing to be mad. It was sort of towards the beginning of Vladimir Putin's presidential tenure, and you kind of started to see it sort of continue through there. So basically what we see here with Russia and Ukraine right now, let's take it back to 2022, what we're seeing the conflict here, it's the latest chapter in this big brother trying to absorb the younger one. back in 2014, Russia, illegally, obviously, as many of you probably know, annexed Crimea, which is a territory within Ukraine. And but a lot of people internationally still recognize that Crimea is independent and it belongs to Ukraine and all of this stuff. But that was another chapter within this crazy rivalry between these two countries. And what this is if Russia kind of ends up absorbing Ukraine here, I think it's kind of crazy to think that Russia is suddenly an empire again. Again, I don't expect them to absorb Ukraine. I think if they were to, even attempt to do that, they would have a lot of foreign troops they'd have to answer to. But you have a country in Russia that has tremendous access to nuclear weapons. And I think nuclear weapons are the thing that scares me the most in this situation. We're not in 1976 anymore. This isn't the Vietnam era where you're only fighting with soldiers and guns and bombs. You're fighting with nuclear weapons. And if a nuclear weapon besides Hiroshima and Nagasaki back in 1945 has not been fired within the course of war. They've been tested in various islands throughout planet Earth. They've been, there've been nuclear reactor leaks in Japan due to natural disasters, but they have never been used in war. But the second a nuclear weapon gets used in war, whether that be Russia, whether that be China, whether that be North Korea, because all these three countries, they have erratic leaders and they have leaders who have decision-making issues that could make a decision on a whim, who are unpredictable. They press the trigger buttons on those nuclear weapons. You're looking at a potential crazy situation in the world. You're looking at potentially a World War III. I know I'm not trying to freak anybody out. I know that's a buzzword and all that, and that's very unlikely to happen, but we're at the era where, like, if a country gets really pissed off, they can easily press their nuclear codes and boom, you're looking at a whole different picture of the world. It's almost happened. It almost happened in 1961 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. That almost happened. I mean, Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy were getting ready to press the nuclear codes and basically blow up the world. It was the hottest the Cold War was. And then it cooled down. Diplomacy and just talking it out cooled everything down. But here we are, 2022. We're Russia and Ukraine. This is something that could, to monitor. You have to monitor when it comes to, again, I'm going to point this out again. When it comes to the three erratic decision makers in the world, Russia, China, and North Korea, you got to watch out because anything can happen at any moment. And when it hits DubCon, when it hits Con 4, when it hits Con 5, you got it. Yeah, when it gets scary, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know what to tell you because DEFCON 4, DEFCON 4. I don't know, dude. Nuclear war is close in this situation, in my opinion, and that scares me. I was just reading more and more about it, and I get more concerned the more I read about it, to be honest. So, I know it's a lot. I know this Russia-Ukraine thing is a lot. I'm not personally saying that we're going to go to nuclear war or that Russia is going to go to nuclear war. I don't think they'll resort to that. I think the situation is going to kind of stay sort of, little bits of violence here and there. But if it does get big, things could get really crazy. And this is why I always, always, always on my podcast suggest, please, for the love of God, all of you, every single one of you, just sit back and actually watch international news and actually worry about other countries because there's a lot on the line with world events, whether it be, it may be 3,500 miles away from your hometown, right? It may be 25, it may be, oceans away, but in reality, effects that are happening across the world affect America. It's a ripple effect. It's what happens in the world. It's just kind of how the world works. So watch your international news, make a decision for yourself. But this Russia-Ukraine stuff is crazy. So I wanted to kind of put that out there. And I wanted to give you guys a valid explanation. I really rushed it on the show because of, again, my dead battery life. But I got to kind of give you the full explanation as to like what I wanted to say and everything I wanted to express. But